Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 19 of SSTO Space Program. Today we'll finally arrive at Eve, but also we will start outfitting our Duna vessel with the first mining modules. There's actually a lot to cover in this episode, so let's jump right into it. Let me start by saying that I have really bad news for you. We have to scrap our current mission to Eve. But don't worry, we'll send another one really soon. What actually happened is that I've taken another look at this ship because, it's almost our entire budget and we can't really afford crashing or stranding it anywhere. And it turns out that this ship probably would not be able to take off from Eve. And this is partly because it was designed poorly by me, so that's my fault. But also I've taken a look at the config files for those engines that we are using, those carborundum fueled engines, and it turns out that they have a really weird ISP curve. So we will have to find a remedy for that. But since we have quite a lot of delta V in the ship, about 200,000 meters per second, we can just turn it around and go back to Kerbal without the need of, going to Eve and then waiting for the launch window. So this is actually pretty convenient. So we can just, cancel this 5,000 meters per second velocity that we have right now, turn the ship back and go straight back to Kerbal. So the problem we have with our ship is twofold actually. One, the acceleration that it has with those engines is not enough to take off from Eve, provided it has really bad aerodynamics. And the second is that those engines are actually not working on Eve. And this is probably, in my opinion, due to a bug or an oversight in the config file. Because if this is an intended behavior for those engines, that actually makes them pretty useless. And I would be very surprised if that was the case. So I've also taken a look at other engines that this mod introduces, and I've changed some of their configurations as well. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. And I also want you to have the full picture of what we are working with. And I want you to be aware of the changes that I've made. So, those carborundum fueled engines, called torch drives that also consume water, are not only very powerful, but they're also hyper efficient. Their ISP in vacuum is 25,000 seconds. And I was actually quite surprised and found them extremely useful when I realized that on Kerbal at sea level, their ISP drops only to about 23,000 seconds or something like that. But it turns out that looking at the ISP curve in the config file, I realized that on Eve at sea level, their ISP would be 0. They would produce no thrust whatsoever, making them absolutely useless. And, I don't like it, okay? And, it's difficult to explain this without going into details how ISP curves in KSP are generated, but it's suffice to say that it's not based on chamber pressure or anything like that. It's purely arbitrary, and I think that this is actually an oversight, and I don't like it. And I decided that I'm going to change it so their ISP would drop to 0 at 15 bars, which is the bottomless bits of Joule, which probably will never get to. But yes, so that's the first change that I've made. Their thrust remains the same, their vacuum ISP remains the same, their Kerbal level ISP remains the same. The only thing that changes is that their drop-off point is at 15 bars, which actually makes them still useful on the surface of Eve, and but they are less efficient. It's like they are probably 20% less efficient than they would be in space in terms of thrust and ISP. So that's the first change. But as you probably expect, when I started looking on config files, I couldn't stop there, and I've taken a look at another engines that were bugging me for quite a long time. FTT introduces also propeller engines, which are, very needed in KSP, but most importantly, it adds electric propellers, which I really like, in reality and in KSP. So, the thing that actually bugs me about those is that their electric charge consumption is insane. It really is insane. It's, how to put this? The smallest engine introduced by this mod has a stationary thrust of 100 kilonewtons, which is, like a little bit less than 2 Juno engines, and it needs 200 electric charge per second, which is absolutely crazy, in my opinion. It's absolutely crazy. And I suppose the reason behind this is that Rover Dude wanted those engines to be difficult to run, so you cannot make like self-sufficient electric helicopters and so on. Okay, I get that. But the point is that it actually limits the power supply to his nuclear reactors. There are no other options that you can actually use to power those engines. And I kind of don't like to be so limited. And I want them to be difficult to use, but also, at least judging by their design, those engines are supposed to be VTOL engines, and those nuclear reactors are really heavy, so the payload capabilities of those engines is really small. It's actually so small that it's pretty pointless. So, I've decided that I will cut the electric requirements for those engines by 10, which actually makes the smallest engine consume 20 electric charge per second, and the larger one, if not the largest, consumes 170 almost electric charge per second, which is still quite a lot if you look at how much electricity you get using stock means. I think the fuel cell array gets you only 18 electric charge per second. So now you can use stock means to power your aircraft, and it makes your aircraft right now difficult to operate, expensive, and it's not overpowered in my opinion. So that's the change I've made. So now going back to our Eve exploration ship. I initially thought that I will use those carbonite fueled jets to help us out of the Eve's atmosphere, but it turns out that the mod that introduces those engines does not introduce proper intakes for them. What it introduces are the intakes that allow you to filter out carbonite from the atmosphere if it's present, which is really cool because you can now refuel in flight, but it's not really working that great as an air intake. And so what I've also changed is that I've added a config line to all these stock intakes that actually allows them to intake not only air but also any other gases, which would be logical in my opinion. And now you can use stock intakes to provide enough air for those engines, and they do not require oxygen to run, so you can run them anywhere, on Eve, on Joule, on Duna, on Leif, or wherever there is any kind of atmosphere, but their ISP is really low. But the main problem we had with our ship is that it doesn't have enough thrust to get out of Eve's atmosphere, and we need to add 6 more carborundum fueled engines to it, but we don't have enough money to do it. So I sent a bunch of those mining tracks to help us get a little bit more money so we can actually afford this mission. And I've also noticed that we had 2 contracts that required mining some ore from Eve and delivering it to Gilly, and doing some Gilly scans, so we'll do that as well. So I needed to equip the ship with the drill and some other things as well. So now we just have to wait until we get that extra money, but don't worry, we have plenty of other things to do. So while we are waiting, I thought that we can send 4 mining forward stations to our Duna vessel, and we'll do it using our OCOD-2 launch vehicle, and you've seen this vehicle so many times that I don't really see a point in running you through the launch characteristics. Suffice to say that the payload that we are carrying is way below the limit of what this vessel can put in orbit, because each forward station weighs a little bit less than 40 tons, and so we are carrying 160 tons of payload, and the limit for this vessel is 440. So we got into orbit really easily, and we had plenty of excess fuel for extra maneuvers and circularizations, and the encounters were set. And yes, now the painful part begins, because the Duna vessel, when it's fully equipped with every module, every mining station, workshops and everything, basically has it's quite heavy on the part count size. So yes, we'll disassemble all the control modules that will help us with docking, but it's already getting difficult, and I actually wanted to save some FPS, and I added only one honey badger control module to those to those forward stations to dock them, and that make the docking so difficult. I mean, I've managed to dock all 4 of them, but the lack of alignment and the difficulty in docking them was a little bit too much even for me, so I'm really sorry if I ruined your day by those crappy docking scenes. But I couldn't figure out better way to do it, and well, it took some time and some struggle, but eventually we were able to dock all of the 4 stations to the ship, and now they are done, and we'll proceed with launching other things as well. Yeah, Duna colony ship will be ready quite soon, I suppose, and definitely before next Duna launch window occurs. Now, before we launch our EVE exploration ship again, this time with all the upgrades, I wanted to show you something very interesting that our rover found on Duna. And as you probably noticed, we found another anomaly, and this one actually is unlike all the others I've seen so far, and is actually pretty useful, and it's worth searching for apart from just finding the Easter egg. And as you can see, it's a monolith, very similar to the one you can find right next to KC, but instead of being black, this one's green. And I think it's also a little bit bigger, maybe, than the one next to KC. Anyway, it looks really nice. It's also solid, so you cannot drive directly through it, like you can with the one which is next to KC and around Kerbal, basically. But what is really interesting about this one, actually, and that blew my mind, honestly, that blew my mind slightly, is that when you find one, and there are multiple monoliths like that you can find around Kerbal system apparently, you will get one science node unlocked for you. So looking for them is actually useful in science or career mode, which is great. I think this is actually a proper way of implementing Easter eggs in the game. Apart from finding them, they actually give you something, so I really like it. It's pretty cool. Okay, so now I think that we are ready to launch our EVE exploration ship again, this time with all the upgrades, with extra engines giving it much more thrust. Now, right now it has a bit over 1.58 G of thrust when in space, so it's still not enough to actually directly ascend on EVE, but hopefully enough to get us into orbit. Well, on Kerbal it could ascend directly upwards, but it's difficult due to it's, as you can see, it's not exactly easy due to a very badly designed aerodynamics. I suppose I should fire the guy who designed it. Yeah, well, the next iteration of this kind of ships should probably take into account some sort of aerodynamics anyway. Yes, we have in this ship, I think around 200,000 meters per second of delta V with the carborundum we have on board, but we don't have that much water, so on the current water load we will have only about 100,000 meters per second. I won't be bothering you with all the ascent and everything, but because you've seen it already the first time. But this time I thought that maybe we could actually use a little bit more fuel this time and cut the transit time even more. And we'll cut the transit time to just about 40 days. And as you see, our trans injection burn is just over 10,000 meters per second. And we will have also 15,000 meters per second for the insertion burn. But out of curiosity, I've actually calculated how much time it would take and how much delta V do we need to go to EVE using brachistochrone trajectory if we chose to do it at closest approach. So at closest approach, distance between Kerbal and EVE is 3.77 million kilometers, so it's not very far away in terms of interplanetary distances. And if our ship had 1g acceleration, I did a very rudimentary math trying to figure it out, we would be burning half of the way forward and then decelerating for another half of the distance. So the burn time to get us to the middle of that distance would be around 13,862 seconds, which is just shy of 4 hours. So the total transit time to EVE at closest approach using brachistochrone trajectory would be a little bit less than 8 hours of constant burn time, obviously. And the top velocity that our spacecraft would have at this point would be 135,000 meters per second, give or take. So yeah, so we don't have that much, but we are really close. I mean, this ship, when it's fully fueled with water and with carborundum, especially with carborundum, could get to over 300,000 meters per second. This is not completely out of the question, which means that, yeah, you could go to EVE using brachistochrone trajectory with those engines. And obviously you would have to set through 8 hours of burn time. Maybe using, you know, physical time warp, you can cut that down to I don't know, 3 hours. It's still quite boring, probably. But I also read on the forum thread that actually the ability to burn using the on-rails time warp is being worked on, as it is available for ion engines in Realism Overhaul. So it's not completely out of the question that at some point we might be able to go to EVE using a brachistochrone trajectory, which is pretty cool. So yeah, as you see, our transit time was just over 40 days, and our insertion burn is a tiny 15,000 meters per second, which is quite mind-blowing. But in terms of burn time, actually, this is comparable with some of the lower thrust SSTOs that I've made so far. But since we have to sit through it anyway, I was thinking that maybe we can talk a little bit about Eve and its real-life counterpart, planet Venus. And there are some differences, obviously, between Venus and Eve. One of the major differences is that everything is smaller in Kerbal Space Program. But unlike Venus, which surface gravity is 0.9 g, surface gravity on Eve is 1.6 g, so it's a bit higher. What is also different is that the atmospheric pressure on the surface of Eve is just 5 atmospheres, but on Venus it's 92 atmospheres, and surface temperature on Venus is also a little bit higher. The average surface temperature on Venus is 735 Kelvin, which is 863 Fahrenheit or 462 Celsius, which is hotter than Mercury. So yeah, pretty cool. On Eve is not that hot. I don't remember exactly, but I think it's below 400 Kelvin, which is really not that hot. I actually had this really funny joke in my head for over a week now, so I think I'll have to share it with you, and you can hate me later. So here it goes. Venus is hotter, but Eve is more attractive. Okay, I'll stop now. Yeah, so as an interesting fact from the history of exploration of Venus is that Venus was almost entirely explored by Soviet Union, and the only landers that were sent to Venus were landers from the Venera program, launched between 1961 and 1984. And those landers broke quite a lot of world first milestones, as we call them here in Kerbal Space Program, one of which was entering another planet's atmosphere for the first time. That was Venera 4 on October 18, 1967, and make a soft landing on another planet. That was Venera 7 on December 15, 1970, and return images from planetary surface, Venera 9 on June 8, 1975, among others, obviously. So this is actually pretty impressive, provided how hellish Venus is, really. And what I also like, and what actually makes me laugh about this program, I know it's not funny really, but just makes me realize how insane the conditions on Venus are, is that the first landers didn't even make it to the surface. Some of them burned in the atmosphere, some of them were my favorite part is that Venera 3 to 6 were run out of battery power before reaching the surface, because the atmosphere is so dense that they were descending too slowly and they were crushed before, or run out of battery power before reaching the surface of Venus. So Venera 7 was so massively over-engineered to ensure its survival that it actually reached the surface, but the parachute failed and it dropped on the surface of Venus at 17 meters per second and toppled over. But it survived and was able to transmit some of the data back to Earth. So it's crazy. And I don't know, I have this picture in my mind of those first landers when they were entering Venus atmosphere, the ones that didn't reach the surface, is that everyone's so happy about, getting the signal that they've reached Venus. then it's like...
Are we there yet?
Not yet.
Hey, are we there yet?
I'm sorry, I know it's stupid, but it kind of makes me laugh. But apart from that, another interesting fact about Venus that actually is also mind-blowing is that apart from the hellish conditions that you will find on the surface that are absolutely unsuitable for life, as we know it, at 80 kilometers altitude, the conditions on Venus are actually the closest to Earth that you can find in the entire solar system. So close, actually, that you could survive on Venus without the spacesuit. You will obviously need a fire resistance gear because the temperature is still quite high and some sort of life support system to provide you with oxygen, but you could survive without the spacesuit. This is also quite interesting when you think about that. There are no other planets that we know of, no other moons around the solar system where you could say that you could survive, let's say, simply with a gear that allows you to breathe. And that's also pretty interesting. Another thing that I find pretty cool about Venus is that one of those Venera landers took pictures of the surface of Venus, and there was a speculation going on for quite some time, that right now it's pretty much disproven, that we found alien life on the surface of Venus. Because on one of those pictures you can see that there is something that resembles a crab. There was one Russian scientist arguing that it might be an alien creature that has been photographed by one of those Venera landers, but it turned out that it's most probably one of the camera caps that broke off and fell. And as you can see, our lander that is obviously inspired by one of those Venera landers also made it to the surface safely, and we could enjoy a very slow descent from 8 kilometers altitude down to the surface of Highlands of Eve, and the drogue chutes were an overkill, and I was actually tempted to cut those chutes off and just descend using simple air braking, as was actually the case with the later Venera landers. So, we will land our SSTO in the next episode, and this is all for today. Thank you very much for watching, I hope that you've enjoyed. If you enjoyed, please consider liking this video. My name is Mark Thrimm, and I will see you next time.